Earth is burning. Through the fractured viewport of an ancient military ship, two men are watching a planet die. The sky above it fills with creatures the size of moons, vast biological intelligences that have been crossing deep space for longer than humanity has had a written language. Through the ship's communications array, transmissions from the surface come through, full of the sound of a world that received no warning. The two men watching this happen are the only people in the known universe who understood the full scope of what was coming, who traveled to the far edge of inhabited space specifically to stop it, and who are now arriving home in time to watch the beginning of the end. That image closes Dead Space 3's Awakened DLC. A moon rises in front of the cockpit window. Everything goes black. The credits roll over the sound of something enormous. For more than a decade, the central debate around this ending has been a practical question. Is any of what Isaac Clarke and John Carver see through that window actually happening? Or has the marker dementia that has been accumulating inside both of them finally crossed a threshold, turning the last minutes of the game into a hallucination so complete that neither man can find the line between what is real and what the signal has constructed for them? That question deserves thorough examination, and this video will give it a full accounting. Beneath the debate about what is real, though, a quieter question has been sitting unanswered. Did Isaac Clarke cause this? And if he did, was that always what the Brethren Moons were planning? This video is a critical interpretation of Dead Space 3 as a work of tragedy, examining how its narrative structure and its characters function as something far more deliberate than a bleak cosmic horror punchline, how its ending reframes everything that came before it, and what the developers' original plans for Dead Space 4 reveal about the franchise's true ambitions for Isaac Clarke's arc. The goal is not to retell the plot, but to examine what the story is doing beneath the surface of its events, and to trace the mechanism that turns a hero's best qualities into the instrument of the worst possible outcome. By the end of this, you'll understand why surviving 3 games is arguably worse than dying in any one of them, why the Brethren Moons may have had less interest in stopping Isaac than most people assumed, and why a man who fought harder than any fictional protagonist to prevent the apocalypse may have been the apocalypse's most useful asset from the very beginning. If something in this lands for you, drop a comment and let the community know which moment resonated. Whether it's a specific lore detail, a connection to something outside the game, or an observation that sits with you after the video ends, that conversation is worth building here. Topic suggestions for future videos are always welcome. Some of the best ideas on this channel have come from people watching in a dark room at 1 in the morning with a thought worth following. Get comfortable, settle in, and let's start at the place Isaac Clarke was hiding before all of this came to find him. Chapter 1. The Man Left Behind. Before the ending of Dead Space 3 can mean anything, the beginning has to be fully understood. Dead Space 3 opens with Isaac Clarke living on a lunar colony called New Horizons, not fighting, not researching markers or monitoring Unitologist activity, or doing any of the things a person with his experience and his specific knowledge of what was building across human space might reasonably be doing. He is living quietly, keeping a low profile, and doing everything in his power to not exist in any context where someone might need something from him. Several years had passed since the events of Dead Space 2. Several years since the sprawl, since the Site-12 marker, since everything on Titan Station ended with an explosion and an evacuation shuttle carrying 2 survivors out of a catastrophe that killed everyone else. In those years, Isaac and Ellie Langford built something together, a relationship, a life that looked, from the outside, like the beginning of stability after 2 successive disasters. Ellie, driven by everything she had witnessed and by her understanding of where the marker crisis was heading, dedicated herself to finding the source. She wanted to understand what the markers actually were, where the signal was originating, and whether there was any path towards stopping it before it ended everything else. Her research eventually led her toward Tau Volantis. Isaac refused to join that effort. When Ellie made clear that she was going to pursue the markers with or without him, and when it became apparent that his refusal to engage was more than a temporary hesitation, She left. The relationship ended. Isaac stayed on New Horizons. Ellie went toward the signal. That refusal is the first thing this story asks the listener to sit with, because it looks on the surface like cowardice or avoidance born from selfishness. The man who walked the Ishimura, the man who survived the sprawl, the engineer who improvised weapons from mining equipment and fought through 2 full necromorph infestations when every better trained person around him died within hours of the crisis beginning. That man looked at Ellie's mission and said no. Understanding why that refusal is something other than cowardice requires looking carefully at what Isaac had actually been through, and at what repeated exposure to catastrophic events does to a human mind over time. Research on trauma accumulation in survivors of repeated catastrophic events documents a consistent pattern. After a first major event, many survivors manage to continue functioning, and some even show a kind of heightened competence under pressure, a narrowed focus that reads from the outside as strength or resilience. After a second event, particularly when the second closely mirrors the first in its structure and its losses, the psychological cost begins to compound in ways that are not immediately visible. The mind, attempting to protect what remains of its capacity to function, begins treating any stimulus associated with the traumatic event as a threat to be preemptively avoided. The survival instinct that once produced effective action under crisis conditions starts producing a different behavior: systematic withdrawal, emotional blunting, a careful narrowing of engagement to only what feels controllable and safe. Isaac's avoidance of Ellie's mission was not surrender. The logic running beneath it was a traumatized nervous system, doing exactly what it had been trained to do. Every conversation about markers, every planning session for a mission into marker-contaminated space, every moment of engagement with the subject that had cost him everything he had ever cared about, all of it registered, below the level of conscious decision, as a threat to be moved away from, rather than toward. The mind does not cleanly distinguish between surviving a necromorph outbreak and mentally rehearsing one. The nervous system responds to both as dangers deserving of the same response. Ellie's departure was not her failing him, or him failing her. Their nervous systems were processing identical events in opposite directions, and those two processing modes could not coexist indefinitely in the same space. Ellie could not remain static when there was still something to fight. Isaac could not re-engage with the thing that had been dismantling him without risking whatever stability he had rebuilt. Here is where the first thread of the tragedy takes hold, before Isaac ever boards the ship to Tau Volantis. The marker signal did not stop broadcasting when Isaac moved to a lunar colony and chose quiet. The dementia that would become a central weapon in the Awakened DLC was not triggered by Tau Volantis. It was building during those years of apparent recovery, embedding more deeply into his neural architecture with every passing month, accumulating in the background of a man who believed that physical distance from the crisis was the same thing as safety from the signal. The marker does not need a person to be standing next to it to work on them. Extended prior exposure appears to establish a baseline sensitivity that continues to develop even in the absence of direct contact. Isaac's years on New Horizons were not years of healing from marker influence. They were years during which that influence operated without the interference of any external crisis to distract him from what it was doing internally. When Captain Norton and Sergeant Carver arrived at the Titan settlement, the man they found was already further along a spectrum of marker-induced neurological change than anyone in the room understood. The mission they brought with them was simple. Ellie had gone missing near Tau Volantis. A team was being assembled to find her and, if possible, understand whether the frozen world held the source of the marker signal. Isaac had every practical reason to decline. He had demonstrated for years that staying away from marker situations was both possible and survivable. The moment Ellie's safety became part of the calculation, the logic of self-protection stopped being sufficient. He agreed to go. This decision, which appears on the surface as straightforward personal loyalty overriding self-interest, contains the entire structural weight of the tragedy that Dead Space 3 is building toward. Isaac does not board that ship to save humanity. His motivation is not the abstract survival of a species or the prevention of a civilizational threat. He goes because Ellie is in danger and he cannot locate, inside himself, a version of his own character that would choose safety over going to her. The distinction between saving humanity and saving one person sounds like a minor character nuance. It is, in fact, the load-bearing element of everything the Brethren Moons will eventually do to him in the Awakened DLC. A person who acts to save humanity will make choices shaped by the requirements of the larger mission and accept certain personal losses as the cost of that mission. A person who acts to save one specific person will make choices filtered through the question of what path most directly preserves that person's safety, and everything else, including potentially the mission itself, will be processed through that filter. By the time the Awakened DLC places Isaac in a position where he must make a decision about the Shockpoint drive, his dementia, combined with his attachment to Ellie and to the idea of getting home, will have created the exact cognitive conditions the Moons need. Sergeant John Carver sits alongside Isaac in this story as something more than a cooperative multiplayer option. He is the structural mirror image of Isaac's situation, the same basic wound processed through a completely different grief. Carver lost his wife Damara and his son Marcus to a necromorph outbreak on Uxor, a planet where he had been stationed as an Earth Defense Force soldier. The outbreak was the direct result of Jacob Danik and the Circle releasing the marker on Uxor deliberately. Carver was on duty when the attack came and arrived at his family's location too late. In the aftermath, he converted his surviving life into a mission to complete what Damara had been working on before she died. Damara had been a data archaeologist studying one of the marker replicas, and her research had uncovered information pointing toward Tau Volantis and toward the Sovereign Colony's historical relationship with the marker signal. Carver organized everything he had left around that mission. Where Isaac processed catastrophic loss by retreating inward, Carver processed it by moving forward. Both responses are well documented in the research on bereavement and operational stress in military populations. Some survivors turn inward, building protective distance, and gradually losing the capacity to engage with anything outside their own pain. Others externalize their grief into purpose, converting the thing they lost into the fuel for continued forward movement. The externalizer appears, from the outside, to have recovered more fully. The mission orientation provides structure, identity, and the constant sensation of progress. What the externalizer rarely confronts is the reality that the mission is performing the emotional work of grief without actually processing it. When the mission ends, or fails, or produces a result that grief alone cannot metabolize, there is nothing between the externalizer and everything they redirected themselves around. Carver is moving toward Tau Volantis at full speed, with nothing but Damara's unfinished work to hold him together. The marker signal on that planet will find exactly what it needs in him. The hallucinations that Carver experiences on Tau Volantis, visions of Damara bloodied and accusatory, his son Dylan's photograph warped into something grotesque, are the marker signal working precisely on the wounds he carried with him, rather than the wounds the planet inflicted. The Brethren Moons do not manufacture horror from nothing when they have adequate raw material to work with. They read the existing damage in a mind and amplify it, the way a hand pressing on a bruise requires less force than creating a new injury from intact tissue. Carver's unprocessed guilt about his family, his conviction that he was insufficient as both a husband and a father, his grief that had never found anywhere to land except the forward momentum of mission, were all already inside him before Tau Volantis. The markers located those specific fault lines and gave them a voice. Isaac's dementia in the Awakened DLC operates identically to Carver's hallucinations. His paranoia, his insistence that installing the Shockpoint drive will lead the Moons directly to Earth, is built on a genuine insight filtered through a mind that can no longer cleanly separate what is true from what the signal has magnified into certainty. The tragedy at the ending of the Awakened DLC is not that Isaac's paranoia is wrong. The thing that makes the ending genuinely function as tragedy is that being wrong and being right both lead to precisely the same outcome. But that is where the story ends. At its beginning, two broken men are headed toward a frozen world at the edge of human-inhabited space, each carrying damage the other cannot fully see, both of them operating on motivations that are adjacent to humanity's survival, without quite being the same thing. Isaac is there for Ellie. Carver is there to complete a dead woman's work. Between those two motivations and the marker signal already present in both their minds, the story is several steps ahead of the people living inside it. What was waiting for both of them on Tau Volantis had been in place for centuries before either of them was born. Other people had already found it. The decision those other people made about what to do with what they found had been quietly shaping the entire Dead Space universe ever since, creating a chain of ignorance so complete that by the time Isaac's ship entered the planet's orbit, no one on board understood what they were actually walking into. The Sovereign Colony's armed forces had been to Tau Volantis before any of them. They found everything, and what they chose to do with that discovery is arguably the most consequential single decision in the entire franchise. Chapter 2: A War No One Remembers. By the time Isaac reaches the orbit of Tau Volantis, the ships circling that world have been dark for 2 centuries. The CMS Terra Nova and its companion vessels drift in the cold between the planet and the stars, ancient military ships from the Sovereign Colony's armed forces, sealed and silent, their corridors preserved by the deep cold of deep space. They are the physical evidence of a civilization that found the answer to the marker question and made a decision about that answer that reshaped every human institution that came after. Understanding what the SCAF found on Tau Volantis and why they responded the way they did is essential to understanding why Isaac Clarke and John Carver arrive on that planet without access to the one piece of knowledge that would have changed everything about how they approached what was buried beneath the ice. The Sovereign Colonies were the dominant human political entity before EarthGov, a federation of colonized worlds in the process of asserting independence from Earth's centralized authority. During the conflict that would eventually break that federation, the SCAF sent researchers to Tau Volantis. The ostensible goal was to understand the marker signal and determine whether the frozen world at the signal's apparent origin held anything scientifically useful. What they found was not useful in any sense the mission planners had anticipated. Tau Volantis had once been home to a civilization. The alien species that had evolved there discovered the markers long before humanity learned to walk upright. The sequence of events that followed their discovery mirrored, with horrifying precision, everything that would later happen to humanity. The markers arrived, or were encountered, or had perhaps always been there waiting for a civilization advanced enough to receive their signal. A religious movement formed around the artifacts, interpreting the signal as divine communication. The movement's believers treated the markers as instruments of transcendence. Convergence began, the process by which the markers aggregate organic matter toward a single rising biological mass. And as the alien population was consumed into this process, a group of survivors, late in their civilization's existence and losing their capacity to sustain complex infrastructure, built something extraordinary. They built a machine capable of freezing an entire ocean world. The scale of this accomplishment is difficult to hold in the imagination. A device capable of arresting planetary atmospheric and oceanic processes, halting the convergence event mid-formation, trapping the half-formed entity that had been rising from the absorbed mass of the world's population in a state of permanent dormancy beneath layers of ice. The alien civilization that built the machine almost certainly did not survive its construction. What they built as a gift for every civilization that came after, for any species that would arrive at this world and understand the warning preserved within its frozen surface. The warning was simple, repeated across every recoverable piece of alien data. The machine must remain active. The thing beneath the ice must remain asleep. If the machine was deactivated, the incomplete entity would wake. If it woke, it would complete the convergence. And once complete, it would call the others of its kind, and they would come. The SCAF researchers gathered this information. They understood the basic architecture of what they had found. One phrase kept appearing in the alien records: the same phrase that was being received by every marker-sensitive human who came near the artifacts. Turn it off. For years, this phrase had been interpreted by human researchers as a directive related to the markers themselves, a signal from the artifacts suggesting that they could be deactivated or shut down. On Tau Volantis, researchers discovered the truth. The phrase was not about the markers. The phrase was the markers, transmitting a message on behalf of the dormant entity beneath the ice, asking anyone who received the signal to deactivate the machine, to let the sleeping thing wake, to undo everything the alien civilization had sacrificed to prevent. Every human who had ever gone mad near a marker, every person who heard voices or experienced visions or built a theology around the signal, had been receiving, in some translated form, a request from a planetary-scale necromorph organism that wanted to be freed. The discovery should have been the turning point, the single piece of information that recontextualized everything humanity thought it knew about the markers and their purpose, should have been shared, should have become the foundation of every policy decision about how to handle the artifacts going forward. Instead, the SCAF leadership made a different choice. They destroyed the research, every document, every data file, every recovered alien record, every personnel log associated with the Tau Volantis mission was purged. The individuals who had conducted the research were removed from the situation in the manner that institutions remove people when the knowledge those people carry is considered more dangerous than the cost of silencing it. The operational scale of this purge was large enough to compromise the SCAF's military capability. During the Secession War, the ongoing conflict between the sovereign colonies and the Earth-aligned authority, the resources and personnel required to suppress the Tau Volantis research were significant enough that the colony's ability to continue fighting was fatally damaged. The sovereign colonies collapsed. EarthGov rose in the space the collapse left. The Dead Space franchise treats this moment as backstory, a piece of lore buried in audio logs and historical fragments scattered across the Tau Volantis environment. The understated presentation obscures how completely this decision determined every catastrophe that followed. Research on organizational behavior in crisis situations has documented what is called the normalization of deviance, a process by which warning signs that should prompt corrective action are instead gradually reclassified as acceptable risk through the combined weight of institutional inertia, self-interest, and the desire to avoid destabilizing an existing operational framework. Across documented cases in various industries and government agencies, warning data has been suppressed, reclassified, or simply buried by people who were not acting from malice, but from a genuine conviction that the existing approach could survive contact with the information if only the information was kept sufficiently contained. The leadership found data that would have required a complete rethinking of every existing marker policy, every existing relationship with Unitology, every existing program of marker-related research, and decided the information was too disruptive to survive. The reasoning was almost certainly pragmatic in its own internal logic. A civilization in the middle of a war does not have the institutional bandwidth to also manage the revelation that every religious artifact it has been studying is a network terminal for a sleeping predator. Better to bury the knowledge, maintain operational focus, and deal with the underlying threat through strategic suppression rather than public confrontation. EarthGov inherited the resulting information vacuum in its entirety. The government that rose from the SCAF's collapse had no access to what the sovereign colonies had discovered, no context for what the markers actually were, no explanation for why the Unitologist faith kept growing, why the signal kept generating the same pattern of behavior in sensitive individuals, why every attempt to study the artifacts safely eventually produced a crisis. EarthGov stumbled through a century and a half of marker interaction with no map, building policies around incomplete data, suppressing the Unitologist movement in ways that generated resentment without addressing the underlying mechanism, and eventually authorizing the Ishimura mission towards its fate, without any understanding of what was buried on that planet. Every catastrophe in the Dead Space universe flows from the SCAF's decision. This is not an exaggeration, and it is not hindsight. Traced forward from that single institutional choice, The information vacuum produces the conditions for each subsequent disaster in sequence. No knowledge of Tau Volantis produces no counter-narrative to Unitology's theology, which produces no meaningful institutional resistance to the proliferation of marker replicas, which produces no accurate assessment of risk for the Aegis 7 mission. The moons did not need to manipulate the SCAF. The SCAF's own institutional reflex to suppress disruptive information accomplished what the moons would have needed centuries to engineer. The cover-up was a gift the markers didn't have to ask for. The markers kept transmitting. The destruction of every human data file about Tau Volantis removed the knowledge of what the signal meant from every accessible record. The signal itself continued to broadcast across human space, finding sensitive neural architectures, embedding in the biology of the people who came near the artifacts, feeding the slow development of a theology that interpreted the message as divine guidance toward unity and transcendence. Each copy of a marker that humanity ever constructed contained the same operational directive. Each person who built a marker, or went mad near one, or contributed to a convergence event, had been, without knowing it, a potential instrument of the things sleeping beneath Tau Volantis's ice. By the time Isaac Clarke was recruited for the mission, the SCAF cover-up had been in place for 200 years. The entire human civilization operating in that period had been navigating a universe full of markers with no understanding of what the markers were for, building policies and religions and military programs around artifacts whose purpose had been known once and destroyed deliberately. The trap that was waiting for Isaac on Tau Volantis had been prepared over 2 centuries by a chain of decisions, each one made by people who believed they were protecting something. Something had been keeping the signal alive. Something needed the path to Tau Volantis to remain findable across 2 centuries of institutional amnesia. Something needed believers to keep appearing, each generation more convinced than the last that the markers pointed toward transformation, and that the thing signaling from beneath the ice of a frozen world was a god worth finding. And by the time Jacob Danik arrived on Tau Volantis with the codex in his hand, what had been doing that work was ready to receive him. Chapter 3. The Believer at the Bottom of the World. Jacob Danik believed he was liberating humanity. This is the detail most people move past quickly, because Danik functions in Dead Space 3 as a straightforward antagonist, the fanatical cult leader whose actions drive the plot toward catastrophe. Treating him as a simple villain misses what makes him one of the most important figures in the entire franchise for understanding how the Brethren Moons actually win. Danik is not stupid. He is not, by the internal logic of his own belief system, cruel. He is a true believer executing what he understands to be a holy mission. And the gap between what he thinks he is doing and what he is actually doing is the exact gap that the markers have been cultivating in human minds for 200 years. Danik led a splinter faction of Unitology called the Circle, a more extreme movement that had broken from the mainstream church of Unitology, where the established church had become, over its long history, a wealthy and politically entangled institution with its own bureaucratic self-interest. The Circle positioned itself as the pure expression of the original faith. Danik and his followers believed that convergence was not something to be feared or delayed. Convergence was the entire point. The rising of the moons, the aggregation of all organic matter into a unified transcendent form, represented the fulfillment of everything the markers had been promising since the faith began. The mainstream church wanted to control the markers and manage their power. The Circle wanted to complete the process the markers existed to begin. From inside Danik's belief system, every action he takes in Dead Space 3 is an act of devotion. Releasing the marker on Uxor, which killed Carver's family, was not murder in Danik's understanding. It was acceleration. Pursuing Isaac's team across space to Tau Volantis was not a military operation against enemies. It was the removal of obstacles standing between humanity and its promised transformation. Deactivating the machine at the climax of the game, freeing the dormant moon, triggering the convergence that had been suspended beneath the ice for longer than the human species had existed. was, to Danik, the single most sacred act any human being had ever performed. Understanding Danik requires understanding a specific feature of how apocalyptic belief systems operate in the real world. Research on movements that anticipate an imminent, total transformation of the world has documented a consistent psychological structure among their most committed members. The believer does not experience the coming catastrophe as catastrophe. The believer experiences it as revelation, as vindication, as the moment when everything they have been mocked for believing will finally be proven true. The scale of the destruction is not a deterrent. The scale of the destruction is the proof. A small transformation could be a coincidence or a delusion. A transformation that consumes an entire world confirms that the belief was real all along. This is why Danik cannot be reasoned with, and why his fanaticism is more dangerous than simple malice would be. A person motivated by malice can be deterred by consequences, negotiated with through incentives, or stopped by making their goal too costly to pursue. A person motivated by the conviction that they are midwifing the salvation of their species experiences resistance as further evidence of their righteousness. Every obstacle Isaac places in Danik's path confirms, in Danik's mind, that he is doing something powerful enough to be worth opposing. The harder Isaac fights, the more real Danik's holy mission becomes. The markers spent 200 years producing exactly this kind of mind. Danik is not an accident or an aberration. He is the intended output of the process that began when the SCAF destroyed the Tau Volantis research and left humanity with no counter-narrative to Unitology's theology. In a universe where the truth about the markers had been preserved, a figure like Danik could have been confronted with evidence. The machine on Tau Volantis exists specifically to keep the moon dormant. The alien civilization sacrificed itself to build it. The message telling believers to turn it off comes from the predator, not from a god. In the actual universe of Dead Space 3, none of that evidence is accessible, because it was deliberately destroyed. Danik operates in the information vacuum the SCAF created, and in that vacuum, his faith cannot be challenged by anything except the direct experience of the horror he unleashes, which arrives only after it is too late to matter. When Danik reaches the machine at the climax of the game, he captures Ellie and threatens her life unless he is given the Codex, the alien device that can control the machine. The Codex can either be used to keep the moon frozen or to free it. Isaac holds the Codex. Carver, standing beside him, makes a choice that will echo through the ending in ways neither man can foresee. Carver takes the Codex from Isaac and throws it to Danik. This moment deserves a slower look, because it is one of the most quietly devastating character beats in the entire franchise, and its meaning is almost the opposite of what it appears to be. Carver, the hardened soldier, the man who converted his entire life into the mission to stop the markers, the man who lost his wife and son to a marker outbreak and dedicated everything to preventing more of them, hands the enemy the single object that will doom humanity. He does it to save Ellie's life. Danik has a weapon to Ellie's head. Carver has spent the entire game watching Isaac's desperation to save her, and somewhere in his own grief, in the space where Damara and Dylan used to be, he cannot let another person die in front of a man who is trying to save them. Carver, who believed in redemption, could not let Ellie die when saving her was within his power. And in that act of mercy, that refusal to sacrifice one specific person for the abstract survival of everyone, he undoes the entire mission. Danik catches the Codex, releases Ellie, and uses it to deactivate the machine. The mirror between Carver's choice here and Isaac's original decision to join the mission is exact. Isaac boarded the ship to save one person rather than to save humanity. Carver hands over the Codex to save one person rather than to protect humanity. The Brethren Moons do not need to corrupt these men or force them into evil. The Moons need only to arrange a situation in which the most human possible choice, the choice to preserve the specific person in front of you over the abstract mass of everyone you will never meet, produces the catastrophe. The best qualities in both men, their capacity for love and loyalty and mercy, become the mechanism of the apocalypse. This is the pattern the entire ending will eventually complete. Hold that shape in your mind as the story continues, because it is going to appear again, at the very end, in a form that is much harder to see coming. The machine deactivates. The dormant moon, incomplete but no longer frozen, begins to wake. The surface of Tau Volantis starts to tear apart as the planet-sized organism strips away the ice and rock that had entombed it for millennia. Danik, standing in the ruins of the alien city at the moment of his greatest triumph, is killed by a piece of falling debris. There is no grand confrontation, no final battle with the villain, no moment where Isaac defeats the man who caused all of this. Danik dies the way an insect dies, crushed by something enormous that does not notice him at all. The manner of Danik's death is not a narrative failure. The manner of Danik's death is the point. A man who believed he was the central figure in a cosmic drama, the chosen instrument of humanity's transcendence, is erased casually by the very force he worked his entire life to unleash. The moon does not thank him. The moon does not acknowledge him. The moon does not care that Jacob Danik existed. He was useful, and then he was in the way, and then he was gone, and the process he served continued without the slightest interruption. Every believer who ever built a theology around the markers receives, in Danik's death, a preview of what the object of their faith actually thinks of them. Ellie escapes on a shuttle. Isaac convinces her to leave, understanding that there is no way to stop what is happening and survive it, and he watches her go. Isaac and Carver, the two men who came to this world carrying their separate griefs, are left alone at the bottom of a collapsing world with a waking God above them. And here, at what appears to be the story's climax, the two of them do something that reframes everything. Chapter 4: The Impossible Survival. They win. Isaac and Carver fight their way through the disintegrating alien city, up into the body of the rising moon itself, and they reach the machine's core. The codex, which Danik used to reject the frozen state and free the moon, can be reversed. Isaac and Carver reactivate the machine and set it to initiate convergence on an incomplete moon, deprived of the mass it needed to complete the process. The moon, unable to sustain the transformation, collapses. It crashes down into Tau Volantis, taking the remains of the alien city with it, and the signal that had been broadcasting from that world for millennia goes silent. Ellie, on her shuttle, watches her instruments. The marker signal that has haunted every character in this franchise, the transmission that drove humanity mad for 2 centuries, is no longer detectable. She grieves for Isaac, believing he died in the collapse. She also allows herself to believe that his death meant something, that the source of the markers had been destroyed, that the nightmare was finally over. The base game of Dead Space 3 ends here. 2 men gave their lives to stop the apocalypse. The threat is gone. The signal is dead. It is a tragic ending, but a clean one, the kind of sacrifice that gives a story's death a shape the audience can hold on to and make peace with. Then Isaac and Carver wake up on the surface of the planet. The Awakened DLC opens with both men alive, having somehow survived a fall that should have killed them, and the collapse of a planet-sized organism directly on top of their position. The game itself does not explain how they survived. Fan communities have argued about it for over a decade, with explanations ranging from the alien technology having some protective effect to the entire sequence being suspect, and the developers never provided a definitive answer within the games themselves. The unexplained survival is not a plot hole to be filled in with a fan theory. The unexplained survival is the first sign that something is wrong with reality itself in the Awakened DLC, and it is the doorway through which the entire question of the ending's meaning enters. Consider what the survival does to the story structure. The base game gave the audience a complete tragic arc. The heroes sacrifice themselves. The threat is destroyed. The survivor grieves and finds a bitter peace. Everything about that ending signals finality. The signal is gone. Isaac is dead. Ellie has closure. Then the Awakened DLC arrives and pulls all of that apart, revealing that the heroes did not die, that the threat is not destroyed, and that the peace Ellie found was built on false information. The clean tragedy is revealed to have been a lie, and what replaces it is something far worse than a clean tragedy could ever be. From the moment Isaac and Carver wake up, the reliability of everything the player sees begins to dissolve. The dementia that had been building in both men throughout the base game intensifies. They encounter Captain Norton, who is obviously a hallucination because Carver killed Norton earlier in the game. They fight through necromorphs while unable to fully trust that the necromorphs are real. Objects appear and disappear. The environment shifts. The two men experience visions that neither can confirm the other is seeing. This is where the Awakened DLC does something structurally daring and rarely acknowledged. The narrative deliberately destroys the audience's ability to distinguish between what is happening and what the markers are constructing. By the time the ending arrives, there is no stable ground left to stand on. Every image can be questioned. Every event can be doubted. The game has spent its entire runtime training the audience to distrust their own eyes, and then it presents an ending that the audience is structurally incapable of verifying. Research on how sustained uncertainty affects the human mind has documented that prolonged inability to determine what is real produces a specific kind of psychological exhaustion. The mind is built to resolve ambiguity, to reach conclusions, to establish which of the competing interpretations of a situation is the correct one. When the situation is engineered so that no interpretation can be confirmed, the mind does not simply accept the uncertainty and move on. It cycles, returning again and again to the unanswerable question, expending energy on a resolution that never comes. The Awakened DLC inflicts this exact experience on both its characters and its audience simultaneously. Isaac cannot know what is real. The player cannot know what is real. Both are trapped in the same cycle, and the trap was built deliberately. On the surface of Tau Volantis, Isaac and Carver make their way through the wreckage, discovering that the marker signal is still active despite the destruction of the moon. Insanity, suicide, and necromorph transformation continue among the scattered survivors of the various factions that came to this world. The threat that the base game seemed to end is demonstrably ongoing. Eventually, the two men learn that a Unitologist ship might carry them off the planet and back toward Earth. They pursue that possibility, watching ships lift off from the surface, until they reach the vessel they were counting on and discover that its shock point drive, the component that allows a ship to travel the vast distances between star systems, is missing. The ship can only take them as far as the CMS Terra Nova, the ancient sovereign colony's vessel drifting in orbit. To go home, they will need to board that derelict, restore its power, and find a working shock point drive somewhere in its frozen corridors. The choice to route the ending through the Terra Nova is not incidental. The Terra Nova is a piece of the SCAF fleet, one of the ships involved in the original Tau Volantis mission 2 centuries earlier. Isaac and Carver, at the end of everything, are forced to climb inside the physical remains of the cover-up that made their entire nightmare possible. The ship that carried the men who found the truth about the markers and were silenced for it becomes the vehicle the last two survivors need to escape. The past is not finished with them. The decision the SCAF made 200 years ago is still, literally, the ground they are standing on. Inside the Terra Nova, they find something waiting. Chapter 5. The Church Inside the Ship. The remnants of the Circle had gotten there first. Survivors of Danik's cult had taken refuge inside the derelict Terra Nova, and in the time they had been there, they had done what human beings under extreme conditions in the presence of a marker signal reliably do. They had built a new faith. With Danik dead and the moon they worshipped now rising toward full awakening, the surviving cultists reorganized their belief around the approaching Brethren moons, treating the coming apocalypse not as a defeat but as the fulfillment they had always been promised. The persistence of the cult after its leader's death and after the apparent failure of its central prophecy is one of the most psychologically accurate details in the entire franchise. Research on what happens to apocalyptic movements when their predictions fail has documented a counterintuitive pattern. A failed prophecy does not typically destroy the movement. Under the right conditions, a failed prophecy strengthens it. When believers have invested enormously in a prediction, sacrificing relationships, resources, and their entire sense of identity for the certainty that a transformation is coming, the arrival of disconfirming evidence produces a crisis that the mind resolves not by abandoning the belief, but by reinterpreting the failure. The prophecy did not fail. The timing was misunderstood. The signs were misread. The transformation is still coming, and the apparent failure was itself part of the plan. The Circle survivors aboard the Terra Nova enact this exact process. Danik is dead. The plan he died for appeared to collapse when Isaac and Carver destroyed the machine. And yet the signal continues. The moon still rises somewhere in the dark, and the believers reorganize their faith around the evidence that their God is not dead, but merely delayed. Their conviction does not weaken in the face of catastrophe. Their conviction feeds on the catastrophe, because catastrophe on this scale can only mean that something enormous is happening, and something enormous is exactly what they have been waiting for. Isaac and Carver fight through these believers, through the necromorphs infesting the ancient ship, and through their own accelerating dementia. Somewhere in the corridors of the Terra Nova, they find a working shockpoint drive, and this is where Isaac begins to fall apart. By this point in the Awakened DLC, the line between Isaac's insight and Isaac's madness has become impossible to locate. He protests installing the shockpoint drive. He becomes convinced, with the intensity of a man who can no longer tell his certainties from his delusions, that if they install the drive and use it to return to Earth, the Brethren moons will follow them home and kill everyone on the planet. He argues that they should not go back. He argues that returning to Earth is precisely what will doom Earth. Carver, holding on to whatever remains of his own sanity, sees this as paranoia. His reasoning is the reasoning of a soldier and a father who lost everything and needs to believe that the mission still means something. Earth has to be warned. Humanity has to be told what is coming so it can prepare, so it can fight, so the deaths on Tau Volantis and on Uxor and on the Ishimura and everywhere else were not for nothing. Carver wants to recover the drive and return home to warn the rest of humanity. Isaac's growing paranoia looks, to Carver, like the final stage of a mind coming apart. A man so broken by the markers that he would abandon the entire species to its ignorance rather than take the risk of the journey home. The two men, who fought side by side through a collapsing planet, turn on each other. The confrontation between them escalates into violence, a hallucinatory sequence in which Isaac and Carver fight, each seeing the other through the distortion of their dementia, each convinced the other has become the obstacle standing between humanity and survival. Isaac sees a man who will lead the moons to Earth. Carver sees a man who will let Earth die uninformed. Both of them are fighting for the survival of the human species, and their conviction that they are doing so is exactly what puts them at each other's throats. Watch how precisely this mirrors what happened with the Codex. When Carver threw the Codex to Danik to save Ellie, the most human choice produced catastrophe. Now, at the end, the two men's shared desire to save humanity produces a fight that stops them from doing anything at all. The pattern is not a coincidence. The pattern is the mechanism, because in the middle of their fight, the hallucination is interrupted by another hallucination. The Brethren moons themselves appear, speaking through the fractured perceptions of both men, and they reveal the thing that recontextualizes the entire conflict. The moons were slowing them down. The fight between Isaac and Carver, the paranoia, the accusations, the violence, all of it was engineered. The moons manufactured the conflict specifically to waste the two men's time. And the reason the time mattered, the reason the delay was worth engineering, is the detail that turns the whole ending into tragedy. The moons reveal that they have known where Earth was all along. The entire premise of Isaac's paranoia, the fear that returning to Earth would lead the moons there, was based on a false assumption. The moons did not need Isaac and Carver to lead them anywhere. The moons already knew the way. The only thing Isaac and Carver could still accomplish was to arrive in time to warn Earth of what was coming, to give the planet some chance, however small, to prepare. And by turning the two men against each other, the moons ensured that even this last, minimal act of resistance would fail. The horror of this revelation operates on two levels at once, and both of them matter for understanding why the ending is a tragedy rather than merely a bleak twist. On the first level, the revelation means that Isaac's paranoia was both wrong and right in the cruelest possible combination. He was wrong about the mechanism. Installing the shock point drive would not lead the moons to Earth, because the moons already knew where Earth was. He was right about the outcome. Earth was going to fall regardless. His dementia produced a false theory that happened to point at a true catastrophe, and his attempt to act on that false theory was itself the thing the moons used to guarantee the catastrophe he feared. A mind coming apart reached, through its own disintegration, toward a genuine truth, and the reaching was harvested and turned into the instrument of the very outcome it was trying to prevent. On the second level, the revelation means that Isaac and Carver never had the agency they believed they had. Throughout the entire base game and the entire DLC, both men operated under the assumption that their choices mattered, that fighting hard enough and thinking clearly enough could change the outcome. The moon's revelation strips that assumption away. The fight the two men had was not a genuine disagreement between two people with free will. The fight was a puppet show, staged by an intelligence vastly beyond them, using their own deepest wounds and best qualities as the strings. After regaining his sanity, Isaac admits that Carver was right all along. He agrees to install the shock point drive. There is nothing else left to do. The paranoia that felt like insight has been revealed as another marker construction, and the only remaining path is the one Carver wanted from the start. They connect the shock point drive to the Terra Nova's ancient reactor and overload it, dumping plutonium cores into the reactor to generate enough power to enter shock space and return to Earth. They are going home, and every foot of the journey home is the moon's plan working exactly as designed. Chapter 6: The Homecoming. Shock space collapses, and the Terra Nova arrives in Earth's orbit. For a moment, before either man understands what he is looking at, there is the possibility of relief. They made it, against everything, across the impossible distance, through the collapse of a planet and the disintegration of their own minds. Two broken men brought an ancient ship home. Isaac tries to communicate with Earth, reaching out across the ship's array toward the planet below, toward the billions of people who have no idea what is bearing down on them. What comes back is not a response. The transmissions coming through are the sounds of a world already being consumed. People screaming, communications cutting off mid-sentence, the specific audio texture of a necromorph outbreak, the same sounds Isaac has been hearing since the Ishimura, now multiplied across an entire planet. Isaac and Carver look out through the cockpit of the Terra Nova, and they see it. The Brethren moons are already at Earth. They arrived first. However the physics of it works, whatever explanation the game does or does not provide, the moons beat the ship home. The planet is surrounded. Will the apocalypse the two men cross the galaxy to prevent is not a future they can still avert. It is a present they have arrived too late to effect. The warning they fought to deliver is meaningless, because there is no one left to warn who does not already know, in the most immediate and final way, exactly what is happening. And then one of the moons rises up directly in front of the Terra Nova. It seems to crash into the ship. The impact knocks both men unconscious. The screen goes black. It is unknown whether this final image is another hallucination or an actual event, and the game ends without resolving the question. That is the last thing Dead Space 3 Awakened shows the audience: a dying world, two men who failed to save it despite doing everything right, and a moon filling the window an instant before darkness. This is the moment where the first arc of everything we have been examining closes, and it closes on a wound that the rest of this video exists to open further, because the obvious reading of this ending is that it is bleak. The heroes lose, Earth falls, the moons win. Roll credits on a franchise that ended, through no fault of its own, on the ultimate downer note. That reading is not wrong, exactly. It is just enormously incomplete. The bleakness of Earth's destruction is the surface of the ending, the part designed to be felt immediately. Underneath that surface, a series of much stranger and much more disturbing questions are waiting, and the answers to those questions transform the ending from a simple tragedy of failure into something considerably harder to sit with. The first of those questions is the one about how the moons got to Earth before the ship. That question sounds like a complaint about physics, the kind of nitpick that fan forums generate about any science fiction ending. It is not a nitpick. The impossibility of the moons beating the ship home is a clue, and it points directly at the possibility that unravels the entire ending. The second question is about the survival. Two men who should have died at the end of the base game are alive for reasons the story never explains. The unexplained survival is not sloppiness, it is a signal. The third question is the one that changes everything, the one that the developers' own plans for the future of this franchise make impossible to ignore. It is a question about Isaac Clarke himself, about what he actually is, about why the markers have spent 3 games keeping him alive when they killed almost everyone else who came near them. That last question is the one that explains why Isaac surviving is worse than Isaac dying. It explains why this ending is not a tragedy about a man who failed to save the world. It is a tragedy about a man who may have been the reason the world could be reached at all, and who was kept alive specifically so that he could carry the thing that would end it home. We are going to get to all of that, but the answer to why people like us are drawn to a story this hopeless, why an ending this bleak became something fans have spent over a decade turning over in their minds rather than simply rejecting, is a lot more uncomfortable than it first appears, and it has less to do with the game than with something in the people watching it. Chapter 7. The question of what was real. Let's take the ending apart carefully, starting with the impossibility that everyone notices and most people set aside. The Brethren moons reached Earth before the Terra Nova did. Isaac and Carver installed the shock point drive, entered shock space, and traveled home. Shock space travel is the fastest means of transit available in this universe, the technology that makes interstellar civilization possible at all. When the two men arrive, the moons are already there, already attacking, already deep into the process of consuming the planet. For that to be literally true, the moons would have to have crossed the same distance faster than the fastest travel humanity possesses, and the game offers no explanation for how a biological entity, however vast and however intelligent, could accomplish that. There are 3 ways to interpret this, and each of them makes the ending worse rather than better. The first interpretation takes the ending at face value and accepts that the moons simply move faster than shock space, through some means beyond human understanding. If this is true, then the implications for the scale of the threat are staggering. It would mean the moons operate on a level of capability that renders human technology, human resistance, and human strategy essentially irrelevant. A species that can cross interstellar distances faster than its victim's best technology is not an enemy that can be fought. It is a force of nature that can only be hidden from, and even hiding may not work, because a network of intelligences that has been consuming civilizations across the galaxy for longer than recorded history presumably knows how to find the ones that try to hide. Under this interpretation, Earth's fall is not a defeat. It is simply the next entry in a process that has been running since before humanity existed, and will continue after humanity is gone. The second interpretation is that the ending, or part of it, is a hallucination. Isaac's dementia had reached a point where he could no longer distinguish reality from marker construction. The game deliberately destroyed the audience's ability to verify anything. It is entirely possible that the arrival at Earth, the transmissions of slaughter, the moon rising in front of the cockpit, are not real events but a final vision constructed by the markers inside the mind of a man they had been dismantling for 3 games. Under this interpretation, the ending becomes a different kind of horror. Isaac may not know what happened to Earth at all. He may be trapped inside a hallucination of Earth's destruction, experiencing the apocalypse he feared most as a construction of the very signal that had been feeding on his fear. The moons would not even need to destroy Earth to defeat Isaac. They would only need to make him believe they had, and let the belief do the rest. The third interpretation is the one that connects the impossibility to the deepest layer of the ending. and it requires understanding something about Isaac that the developers planned, but the finished games only hint at. Under this interpretation, the reason the moons could reach Earth is that they did not have to travel there the way a ship travels. The signal was already at Earth. It had been at Earth all along, broadcasting through every marker, embedded in the neural architecture of every sensitive human, present in the mind of every unitologist who ever prayed toward it. The moons did not need to physically cross the distance because, in a meaningful sense, the thing that makes a moon was already distributed across human space, waiting inside the minds it had been cultivating for 2 centuries. And the person carrying the most concentrated version of that signal, the person whose mind had become the clearest channel for it, was flying the ship. To understand why that third interpretation is not a fan invention, but something the developers actively intended, we have to look at what Dead Space 4 was supposed to be, and at what the original plan for Isaac Clarke's arc reveals about the character he had been all along. But before we go there, sit with the shape of the problem for a moment. The genius of the Awakened DLC's ending is that it makes all 3 interpretations available at once and refuses to confirm any of them. The audience cannot know whether Earth fell, whether Isaac imagined it, or whether Isaac carried the thing that destroyed it. And that inability to know is not a weakness in the storytelling. That inability is the storytelling. The markers spent 3 games making Isaac unable to trust his own perception. The ending extends that condition to the audience, forcing everyone watching to experience the same epistemological collapse that Isaac has been living inside. The uncertainty is not a gap in the ending. The uncertainty is the ending's most complete expression of what the markers actually do to a mind. Consider what it would mean to be Isaac in that final moment, regardless of which interpretation is correct. If Earth fell and he witnessed it, he watched the failure of everything he sacrificed for. If Earth fell and he only imagined it, he is now so far gone that he cannot access reality even at the moment of ultimate consequence. If Earth fell because he carried the signal home, he is the instrument of the apocalypse he spent 3 games fighting. Every version of the ending places Isaac in a distinct hell, and the game declines to tell him, or us, which hell he is in. There is a specific cruelty in that design. Death would resolve the uncertainty. A man who dies stops having to wonder what was real. Isaac, at the end of Awakened, is denied even that resolution. He is knocked unconscious, and the story leaves him suspended in a darkness that could be death, or could be the prelude to waking up again inside whatever the moons have planned for him next. The absence of a confirmed death is the absence of an ending. Isaac is left in a state with no closure, no certainty, and no way out, which is, when examined closely, exactly the state the markers have been trying to produce in him since the Ishimura. Chapter 8, The Herald. Here is what Dead Space 4 was going to be, and here is why it changes how the entire ending should be understood. The developers who built the Dead Space franchise had a plan for where Isaac Clarke's story was going, and that plan predates the finished version of Dead Space 3. During the development of Dead Space 3, the creative team, including the franchise's creative director, developed an original vision for the 3rd chapter of Isaac's psychological journey, and for a 4th game that would conclude it. That original vision was reworked significantly before the version of Dead Space 3 that shipped, largely due to publisher demands that pushed the games toward more action and away from horror. But the original conception of Isaac's arc survived in interviews, and what it reveals about the character is essential. In the original plan, Isaac was going to be revealed as something the markers had been shaping toward a specific purpose. The story would have emphasized his dementia and his deteriorating grip on reality, and it would have featured Isaac operating alongside a dark version of himself, a manifestation of the marker's influence given form as a second Isaac. The trajectory of that story was going to lead somewhere no fan expected the first time they picked up Dead Space and controlled a heroic engineer fighting to survive. Isaac was going to lead the Brethren Moons to Earth, not by accident, not as a mistake, because of what he was. The reason Isaac would have led the moons home is that his DNA was compatible with the marker signal. He was, in the language the developers used, a herald of the markers. His particular biology made him uniquely suited to carry and channel the signal, which is why the markers had been so persistent with him. Why the hallucinations of Nicole followed him from the Ishimura to the sprawl, why he survived when nearly everyone around him died. Isaac was not surviving in spite of the markers. On some level, Isaac was surviving because the markers had a use for him, and that use was to be the instrument that finally brought the moons to the largest concentration of human life in the galaxy. Dead Space 4, in this original plan, would have been the final confrontation at Earth, with Isaac facing his destiny and fighting against the moons. The word the developers used was destiny, which is a specific and telling word. Isaac's arc was not going to be the arc of a man who kept getting unlucky. It was going to be the arc of a man who had been chosen, marked, and used, whose entire journey across 3 games had been, from the marker's perspective, the slow delivery of a perfectly compatible carrier to the target that mattered most. Now return to the ending of the Awakened DLC with this in mind, and watch how the impossibilities resolve. The moons reaching Earth before the ship stops being a physics problem. If Isaac is a herald, if his compatible DNA makes him a living channel for the signal, then in a meaningful sense the moons were already at Earth the moment Isaac arrived, because Isaac was carrying the thing that makes a moon what it is. The shock point drive did not just carry 2 men home. It delivered the herald to the world the markers had been reaching toward for 2 centuries. Isaac's paranoia in the DLC stops being a symptom of madness and becomes a fragment of buried truth. When Isaac protested installing the shock point drive, when he insisted with the desperate certainty of a disintegrating mind that returning to Earth would doom everyone on it, he was not simply wrong. Some part of him, some part that had absorbed enough of the signal to half understand what he was, recognized that he himself was the danger. He could not articulate it correctly. His dementia scrambled the insight into a false theory about the moons physically following the ship. But underneath the false theory was a real perception. If I go home, everyone I am trying to save will die, and it will be because of me. The moons manufacturing the fight between Isaac and Carver takes on a new dimension too. The moons said they were slowing the 2 men down, ensuring they could not warn Earth in time. But if Isaac was the herald, then the moons had an additional reason to want him to complete the journey. They needed him to arrive. A fight that ended with Isaac refusing to install the drive and remaining at Tau Volantis would have kept the herald away from the target. The moons had to resolve the conflict in a way that got Isaac onto the ship and pointed at Earth. Carver being right, Isaac regaining his sanity and agreeing to install the drive, the 2 men working together to power the reactor and enter shock space. All of it served the moon's actual goal, which was not to prevent a warning, but to deliver a carrier. This is why the ending is a tragedy in disguise rather than a simple downer. A simple downer is a story where the heroes try their best and lose to a stronger enemy. The Dead Space 3 ending, read through the developer's intended arc, is something far worse. It is a story where the hero's every virtue, his love for Ellie, his loyalty to Carver, his determination to warn Earth, his refusal to give up, was the exact mechanism by which the catastrophe was accomplished. Isaac did not fail to save the world. Isaac was the delivery system, and the harder he fought, the more efficiently he delivered. Hold on to that reframing, because it raises a question that we have not answered yet, and the answer to it is where this story goes from tragic to genuinely disturbing. If Isaac was the herald, if his purpose was to bring the moons to Earth, then his survival at the end of the base game, the impossible survival that the game refused to explain, was not luck, it was necessary. The markers could not let their herald die at Tau Volantis, because a dead herald delivers nothing, and that means the moment in the base game where Isaac and Carver sacrificed themselves to stop the moon, the moment that was supposed to be the noble, tragic climax of the entire franchise, may have been the markers allowing a sacrifice that could never have worked, because the man making it was too valuable to let die, which forces a much darker question about the whole trilogy. How many of Isaac's victories were real? Chapter 9. The victories that were never won. Go back to the beginning. go all the way back to the Ishimura. At the end of the first Dead Space, Isaac Clarke did something that should have been impossible. He was one man, an engineer with no combat training, dropped into a mining ship where hundreds of trained crew members had already died. He fought through the entire vessel, uncovered the truth about the marker and the hive mind, and destroyed both. He escaped when no one else did. At the time, it read as the triumph of an ordinary person's ingenuity and will against overwhelming horror. That is how survival horror is supposed to work. The powerless protagonist endures through cleverness and determination and earns their escape. But the secret ending of the first game complicated that reading immediately, and the developer's intended arc for Isaac complicates it further. In the alternate ending, Isaac's dead girlfriend Nicole appears to him and attacks him, revealing that the Nicole who had been guiding him throughout the game was a marker hallucination all along. That ending suggested Isaac left the Ishimura already corrupted, already carrying the signal, already destined to build a new marker from the memories the artifact had embedded in his mind. Dead Space 2 opens with exactly this, an Isaac who, in the intervening years, had helped build a new marker on the sprawl, his compatible mind used as the template for the artifact's reconstruction. Consider what this means for the idea of Isaac's victories. If the markers wanted Isaac alive because he was a compatible carrier, then his survival on the Ishimura was not a victory over the markers. It was the markers preserving an asset. Isaac believed he was fighting his way to freedom. From the markers' perspective, he was being kept alive and gradually saturated with the signal, carried out of one disaster so he could seed the next. The hive mind he destroyed was real, and the immediate threat he ended was real, but the larger process he thought he was escaping had already claimed him. He walked off the Ishimura carrying the thing that would build the Site 12 marker, which would produce the Sprawl disaster, which would drive him toward Tau Volantis. Research on how people construct narratives of their own agency has documented a persistent human tendency to interpret survival and success as the result of personal choice and effort, even in situations where outside forces were the decisive factor. The mind resists the idea that its victories were arranged, that its escapes were permitted, that the sense of hard-won triumph was operating inside a larger design it could not see. Isaac spends 3 games experiencing his survival as achievement. The story, read through the developer's intended arc, suggests that his survival was closer to cultivation. He was being grown, exposure by exposure, disaster by disaster, into the perfect vessel for the signal, and every escape that felt like winning was the markers moving their most valuable piece to the next position on the board. This does not mean Isaac accomplished nothing. The distinction matters because a story where the hero is purely a puppet is not tragic, it is merely nihilistic, and Dead Space 3 is doing something more precise than nihilism. Isaac's fights were real, his suffering was real. The people he tried to save, Nicole's memory, Ellie, Carver, the anonymous survivors he encountered across 3 games, mattered to him genuinely, and his efforts on their behalf were sincere. What the story reframes is not the reality of his struggle, but the meaning of its outcomes. Isaac won every battle he could see, and lost the war he could not, because the war was being fought on a level his perception could not reach, using him as a weapon against the very thing he was trying to protect. The tragedy of a puppet is that it has no will. The tragedy of Isaac Clarke is that he has enormous will, and all of it was harnessed. He is not a man without agency. He is a man whose agency was the instrument. Every choice he made freely, and he made them freely, served a purpose he did not choose and could not perceive. That is a far more unsettling condition than simple helplessness, because it means his freedom and his enslavement were the same thing. The more fully he acted as himself, the more completely he served the markers, because the markers had arranged the situation so that Isaac, being Isaac, produced exactly what they needed. Return once more to the ending at Earth with this fully in view. Isaac Clarke, the Herald, arrives home carrying the signal, having been kept alive across 3 disasters specifically for this delivery, his every virtue converted into a component of the mechanism. He looks out the window and sees the moons already at Earth, And whether that image is real, hallucinated, or the direct consequence of his own arrival, the meaning is the same. The man who fought hardest to prevent the end of humanity was the specific tool by which humanity's end was reached. He did not fail, he was used. And the using required his success, not his failure, which is why he was never allowed to truly lose until the moment his loss no longer mattered. There is a specific horror in being valuable to something that intends to destroy everything you love. A person can survive being hated, being hunted, being opposed. Isaac was none of those things to the markers. He was cherished in the way a farmer cherishes the crop he intends to harvest. The markers kept him alive, protected him through impossible odds, guided him with the face of the woman he loved, and delivered him at last to the place where his existence could do the most damage. The care was real. The care was the trap. Chapter 10. Surviving is the punishment. And here is the detail that turns all of this from a story about the end of the world into a story about two specific men who will have to live inside that end. The developers confirmed that Isaac and Carver survived the ending of the Awakened DLC. When the moon crashed into the Terra Nova and the screen went black, that was not their death. In the plans for Dead Space 4, both men were alive, and Carver in particular was considered as a possible protagonist for the sequel, which means he survived the Terra Nova's destruction and continued into whatever came next. The franchise was going to pick up from a humanity facing extinction at the hands of the Brethren Moons, with survivors scavenging from ship to ship, trying to endure day by day against a galaxy that was being consumed. The two men who watched Earth fall did not die watching it. They lived. Sit with what that means, because it is the exact inversion of what a tragic ending is supposed to offer. In a conventional tragedy, the hero's death is the release, the sacrifice at the end of the base game. Isaac and Carver giving their lives to stop the moon was the kind of ending that gives the audience something to hold on to. They died for a reason. Their deaths meant something. The peace Ellie found was built on the belief that their sacrifice had ended the threat. That is the version of the story where death is a mercy, because it lets the heroes stop, lets their struggle reach a conclusion, lets them rest. The actual ending takes that mercy away. Isaac and Carver do not get to die at the moment of sacrifice. They survive it, which means they have to keep going. They have to wake up again. They have to keep fighting through the Terra Nova, keep losing pieces of their minds to the dementia, keep pushing toward a home that no longer exists in the form they remember. And when they finally reach Earth, the reward for all of that survival is watching the planet die and understanding on some level that they arrived too late to stop it and possibly helped cause it. Then they survived that too. The moon crashes into the ship and they are still, somehow, alive, carried forward into a universe where humanity faces extinction, and there is no version of victory left to fight for. This is the framing that makes Dead Space 3's ending a genuine tragedy rather than a bleak spectacle. The horror is not that the heroes die. The horror is that they do not. Surviving is the punishment. Living is the sentence. Isaac Clarke, who spent 3 games fighting to survive, who endured the Ishimura and the Sprawl, and Tau Volantis, who lost Nicole and sent Ellie away and watched everyone around him die, is condemned by the story to keep surviving into a world where his survival has stopped meaning anything except the continuation of his own suffering. Research on the psychology of survivors of mass casualty events has documented a phenomenon often called survivor's guilt, but the condition Isaac faces is something more extreme than guilt at having lived while others died. Isaac would face the knowledge, if he retains enough sanity to hold it, that his living was not incidental to the deaths of everyone else but connected to them, that he was the one carried through, the one kept alive, the one delivered to the place where the end began. The survivor who believes their survival was random can eventually make some peace with it. The survivor who understands their survival was purposeful, and that the purpose was the destruction of everyone else, has no such peace available. There is no framework in which that can be metabolized into anything livable. Carver's version of this is its own specific hell. Carver came into the story having already lost his wife and son to the markers, having already stood at the edge of that loss with nothing left to hold on to, having converted everything he had left into the mission to stop the thing that killed his family. The mission was the structure holding him together. The mission was the externalized form of a grief he never processed, and the mission failed. Everything he redirected himself around, everything he built his surviving self on top of, collapsed at Earth. Carver watched the markers do to the entire human species what they had already done to Damara and Dylan, and he survived to carry that knowledge forward, with nothing left to organize it around. The soldier who lived for the mission outlived the mission's total defeat. Both men are left in the condition the markers seem to specialize in producing. Not death, which would be an ending, a continuation with no possibility of resolution, a survival that is indistinguishable from punishment, a life that persists specifically so that the suffering can persist with it. The markers do not simply kill. When they have a use for someone, they keep them. And the keeping is worse than the killing, because the killing at least stops. There is a line the moons deliver to Isaac and Carver in the hallucinations, a taunt about the prophet and the god, about the chance to warn Earth having come and gone, about the moons being hungry and being here. The exact wording belongs to the game. What matters is the posture behind it. The moons are not angry at Isaac and Carver. The moons are not vengeful. The moons are amused, in the way something vastly powerful is amused by the struggles of something small that never had a chance and did not know it. And then the moons move on, because Isaac and Carver, like Danik, were useful and are now largely beside the point. And the process the moons serve continues into a galaxy full of worlds that have not yet been reached. The two men survive into the aftermath of that. They are alive at the end. And being alive, in the world the ending leaves them in, is the cruelest thing the story could have done to them. Chapter 11. The Dark Isaac. There is one more element of the original plan that deserves a full examination, because it is the piece that reveals what kind of story Dead Space was always trying to be underneath its monsters and its dismemberment mechanics. The intended arc for Isaac included a dark version of himself, a second Isaac, a manifestation of the marker's influence, a figure that would have externalized the corruption growing inside the real Isaac and given it a face and a will of its own. This dark Isaac was going to be part of the story that led the real Isaac to bring the moons to Earth. The finished games only gesture at this concept, but the intention behind it tells us something crucial about how the franchise understood its own protagonist. The Dark Isaac is a way of visualizing a truth about the character that the games could only partially show. Isaac was never a person the markers acted upon from the outside. The markers worked inside him, growing something that used his own mind as its medium. The Dark Isaac would have made this literal, splitting the character into the man he believed himself to be, and the thing the signal had been building inside him, and forcing the real Isaac to confront the possibility that the two could no longer be cleanly separated. Where does Isaac end and the marker's construction begin? By the third game, the honest answer is that no one, including Isaac, can say for certain. This is the deepest layer of the tragedy, and it is the one that connects Isaac's specific story to something universally human. The horror of the markers is not primarily that they create monsters out of corpses, though they do. The deeper horror is that they colonize a living mind so gradually and so intimately that the person cannot tell which of their own thoughts are theirs. Isaac's love for Nicole was used against him, the marker wearing her face to guide him. Isaac's determination to survive was used against him, keeping the Herald alive for delivery. Isaac's paranoid insight in the Awakened DLC, the true perception that returning home would doom everyone, was scrambled by the same signal that produced the insight, so that the truth arrived inseparable from the madness. At every level, the thing Isaac was fighting was operating through the exact faculties he was fighting it with. A person can resist an enemy that is outside them. The tragedy of an enemy that is inside you, that thinks with your thoughts and feels with your feelings and wants through your wants, is that resistance and surrender become impossible to distinguish. Every act of will Isaac performs might be his own, or might be the signal's, and he has no vantage point from which to check, because the faculty he would use to check is the compromised one. The Dark Isaac would have dramatized this by giving the internal colonizer a body. But the concept was always present in the character, from the moment Nicole first appeared to guide him through the Ishimura. Consider how this reframes the relationship between Isaac and the markers across all 3 games. The markers do not hate Isaac. The markers do not want to destroy Isaac, at least not until his usefulness ends. The markers want to become Isaac, to grow inside him until the boundary between the man and the signal dissolves entirely, at which point Isaac would carry them wherever they needed to go while still believing he was acting on his own behalf. The Dark Isaac is what that process looks like when it is nearly complete, a version of the self that is fully the markers and still wears the same face, still remembers Nicole, still speaks in Isaac's voice. The horror the developers intended was not Isaac being replaced by a monster. It was Isaac becoming a monster while remaining in every way that mattered to him, himself. This is why the ending's ambiguity about what is real is not a flaw, but a fulfillment of the character's entire arc. By the end of the Awakened DLC, Isaac's perception is so thoroughly compromised that the audience shares his condition. We cannot tell what is real because he cannot tell what is real, and he cannot tell because the thing distorting his perception is inside his perception. The Dark Isaac, whether or not it ever appeared on screen, is the truth of what Isaac had become. A man whose interior had been so colonized that his own mind was no longer a reliable witness to his own life. The moon in the window at the end could be real or could be a construction, and Isaac has no way to know, because the apparatus he would use to know has been the marker's territory for a long time. Research on the psychology of intrusive thoughts and the experience of losing trust in one's own mind has documented how destabilizing it is for a person to no longer be certain which mental events originate with them. The experience is described by those who live with it as a kind of internal exile, a sense of being a stranger inside one's own head, unable to trust the very instrument through which all experience is filtered. Isaac Clarke lives in a permanent and externally imposed version of this condition. The markers made his own mind foreign to him, and they did it so gradually, across so many years and so many disasters, that there was never a single moment where he could have pointed and said, "Here, this is where I stopped being only myself." The Dark Isaac is the name for that stranger, and the tragedy is that by the end, the stranger and Isaac may be the same person, delivered home together, looking out the same window at the same dying world. Chapter 12. The message hidden in the chapters. There is a detail woven into the structure of Dead Space 3 that most people only notice after someone points it out, and once it is pointed out, it changes how the entire game reads from the first minute. Take the first letter of each chapter title in Dead Space 3 in order and read them as a single line. They spell a message: Brother Moons are awake. The game announces its own ending in its own architecture, hidden in a place almost no one thinks to look until they already know what they are looking for. This is not the first time the franchise did this. The first Dead Space did the same thing, and the message its chapter title spelled was "Nicole is dead," the central secret of that entire game, sitting in plain sight from the opening chapter for anyone who thought to assemble it. This structural habit is worth pausing on, because it is doing something more than providing a clever bit of trivia for attentive fans. The hidden message is a formal expression of the franchise's deepest theme, which is that the truth was always available and was always ignored. In the first game, Nicole was dead from the beginning, and Isaac spent the entire story being guided by a hallucination of a woman who no longer existed, unable to see the truth that the game had literally spelled out in its own bones. In the third game, the Brother Moons were awake, or waking, from the beginning, and the entire cast spent the story pursuing goals and fighting battles under the shadow of an outcome that the game had already announced. The message in the chapter titles is the game telling the audience, before anything happens, how it ends, and the audience cannot read it until they already know, which is exactly the condition every character in the story lives inside. The truth about the markers was available to humanity for 200 years, encoded in the alien records the SCAF destroyed. The truth about Isaac being a Herald was present in his biology from the beginning. The truth about the moons being awake was written into the structure of the very game the player was holding. In every case, the information was there, and in every case, it could not be perceived until it was too late to act on it. This is one of the most sophisticated things the Dead Space franchise does, and it connects directly to the real-world psychology that runs underneath the entire series. Human beings are not primarily undone by information they lack. Human beings are undone, over and over, by information they possess and cannot act on, by warnings that were available and were reinterpreted or suppressed, or simply not believed until the disaster made them undeniable. Research on how organizations and individuals process warning signs before catastrophes has documented this pattern across a wide range of failures. The signals were there, someone saw them. The problem was almost never a total absence of information. The problem was the gap between having the information and being able to treat it as real. The hidden message in the chapter titles is a formalization of that gap. The game gives you the ending in advance and relies on the certainty that you will not read it, because you have no reason to look, because the information is presented in a form your attention slides past. And when you finally assemble it, after the ending has already landed, you experience in miniature the exact tragedy the whole game is about. You had it the entire time. You could not see it. By the time you could, it was over. Isaac's story is this pattern lived at maximum intensity. The truth of what he was, the truth of where he was headed, the truth of what his survival meant, were all present from the beginning, encoded in his biology, and in the marker's persistent interest in keeping him alive. He could not read the message, neither could the people around him, neither could the audience the first time through. The brother moons were awake, and everyone found out in the same order, after it no longer mattered. Chapter 13. Why we return to hopeless stories. Earlier, a question was left hanging, and it is time to answer it, because the answer is more uncomfortable than the game itself. Why do people return to a story this hopeless? Dead Space 3's ending offers no victory, no redemption, no meaningful resistance to an overwhelming force. The heroes fail, the world falls, and the survival that remains is worse than death. By every conventional measure of what makes a satisfying story, this should be an ending people reject, forget, or resent. Instead, fans have spent over a decade turning it over, arguing about what was real, constructing interpretations, refusing to let it go. Something about a total, unredeemable defeat keeps pulling people back. Understanding why says something about the people watching, not just the story they are watching. Part of the answer is that a certain kind of person finds honesty more compelling than comfort, even when the honesty is bleak. Most stories promise that effort is rewarded, that virtue matters, that the protagonist's struggle bends the outcome towards something better. Those promises are comforting, and they are also, a certain kind of viewer suspects, not entirely true to the world as it actually operates. Dead Space 3 offers the opposite promise. It says that effort can be harnessed against you, that virtue can be the mechanism of catastrophe, that the protagonist's struggle can be exactly what the enemy needed. For a viewer who has felt in their own life that trying hard did not guarantee a good result, that doing everything right did not prevent the bad outcome, there is a strange relief in a story that admits this openly. The bleakness is not depressing to such a viewer. The bleakness is honest, and the honesty is a kind of company. Part of the answer is deeper, and it connects to why cosmic horror as a genre exists at all. The Brethren Moons represent a specific fear that predates the video game by more than a century of horror fiction, and predates the fiction by the entire history of human consciousness. It is the fear that the universe is vast and old and indifferent, that human meaning is small and local, and does not register on the scale where the important things happen, that the structures we build to make ourselves feel significant, our religions and our missions and our loves, are visible only to us and mean nothing to the forces that actually determine our fate. This fear is not pleasant, but it is not exactly avoidable either. Most people encounter some version of it, usually in the dark, usually alone, usually at the moments when the ordinary machinery of daily distraction stops working. A story like Dead Space 3's ending gives that fear a shape. It takes the formless dread of cosmic indifference and renders it as a moon in a window, as a taunt from something enormous, as two men watching a world die. And there is a documented psychological value in giving a fear a shape. Research on how people process anxiety and dread has found that a fear which can be named, examined, and given a form is more manageable than a fear that floats free and formless. The horror story does not remove the fear. What it does is contain it, temporarily, inside a frame the viewer can look at from the outside, in the safety of a dark room, with the knowledge that they can turn it off. The viewer gets to approach the edge of the abyss, feel the pull of it, and then step back. The stepping back is only possible because the approach was controlled. This is why the cozy horror format works the way it does, why people put on stories about the end of the world to fall asleep to. The apparent contradiction, that a story about total defeat could be comforting enough to sleep to, dissolves once you understand what the story is actually providing. It is providing a container. It is taking the largest and least manageable fear a person carries, the fear of insignificance in an indifferent universe, and holding it inside a narrative with a beginning and an end, with characters to care about, with a voice narrating in the dark. The fear is real, and the story does not pretend otherwise. But the story surrounds the fear with structure, and structure is what makes a fear survivable. Isaac Clarke could not survive his story. The viewer, watching Isaac's story from the safety of their own bed, survives it every time, and in surviving it, practices, in some small way, surviving the fear it represents. There is a final layer to why this particular ending holds people, and it returns to the Herald. The most disturbing element of Isaac's arc is that his best qualities were used against him. His love, his loyalty, his determination, all converted into components of the disaster. This is a fear that lives close to the surface for a lot of people. The fear that the things they value most about themselves might not be enough, might even be liabilities, might be exactly the handles by which the world grabs them and uses them for purposes they never chose. Isaac is a figure onto whom that fear can be projected and examined. Watching him, a viewer gets to consider the possibility that virtue is not protection, that being good does not guarantee a good outcome, that a person can do everything right and still be the instrument of everything going wrong. And having considered it, in the container the story provides, the viewer gets to close the container and go to sleep, carrying the thought with them but no longer overwhelmed by it. That is the uncomfortable answer to why people return to hopeless stories. Not because they enjoy hopelessness, but because a hopeless story told well does something a hopeful story cannot. It meets the darkest suspicion a person carries and treats it as real, and in treating it as real, makes it, for a while, bearable to hold. Chapter 14. The Shape of the Whole Tragedy. Let's zoom all the way out now, past the individual scenes and the specific revelations, and look at the entire shape of what Dead Space 3's ending accomplishes as a tragedy. This is the part where we diagnose not a character, but the whole architecture of the thing. A tragedy, in the oldest and most precise sense, is not simply a story where bad things happen. A tragedy is a story where the catastrophe emerges necessarily from the nature of the person it destroys. The hero is not undone by bad luck or external villainy alone. The hero is undone by the specific qualities that make them who they are, so that the disaster feels less like an accident and more like the inevitable expression of a character meeting a world built to exploit exactly that character. The oldest tragedies understood this. The hero's greatness and the hero's downfall are the same trait viewed from two angles. Dead Space 3's ending fits this ancient structure with a precision that its reputation as an action game tends to obscure. Isaac Clarke's defining quality across 3 games is his refusal to stop. He survives when others die because he will not give up, will not lie down, will not accept the outcome that everyone around him accepts. On the Ishimura, that refusal saved his life. On the Sprawl, it saved his life again. It is the quality that makes him a hero, the engine of every escape. the thing that separates him from the hundreds of people who died in the same disasters he walked out of, and it is the exact quality the markers needed. A herald who gave up would deliver nothing. A carrier who accepted death at the first disaster would never reach Earth. The markers required a mind that would fight through anything, endure any horror, survive any catastrophe, because only such a mind could be carried across 3 disasters and delivered, still alive, to the target that mattered. Isaac's refusal to stop, the very heart of his heroism, was the feature that made him useful. His greatness and his role in the apocalypse are the same trait viewed from 2 angles. He could not have been the hero without being the herald, because the qualities are identical. This is what makes the ending a tragedy in the full and ancient sense, rather than merely a sad conclusion. Isaac is not destroyed by something external to himself. He is destroyed by himself, by the deepest and best part of himself, weaponized by a force that understood that part better than he did. If he had been weaker, he would have died early and delivered nothing. If he had been less loving, he would not have gone to Tau Volantis for Ellie. If he had been less loyal, he would not have worked with Carver to power the reactor. If he had been less determined, he would have given up before reaching Earth. Every virtue was a requirement. The markers did not need to corrupt Isaac's character. They needed his character exactly as it was, and they built a situation in which Isaac, being fully and admirably himself, produced the end of the world. The same shape governs Carver. His defining quality is devotion, the capacity to organize his entire self around the people and the mission he loves. That devotion is what makes him sympathetic despite his hardness, what gives his grief its weight, what makes his choice to save Ellie with the Codex feel human rather than foolish, and it is the quality that undoes everyone. His devotion to Ellie's safety hands Danik the Codex. His devotion to the mission drives him to insist on reaching Earth. At every point, the thing that makes Carver worth caring about is the thing that advances the catastrophe. Greatness and downfall, the same trait, 2 angles. Even Danik fits the pattern, though he is the villain. His defining quality is faith, total and unshakable belief. That faith is what makes him formidable, what makes him impossible to deter, what gives him the certainty to pursue his goal across the galaxy, and it is what gets him crushed by falling debris in the moment of his triumph, erased by the God he served, his faith rewarded with the specific indifference that all the believers in this universe are ultimately shown. His conviction and his meaningless death are the same trait, 2 angles. The markers, and the moons behind them, win not by being stronger than their opponents, though they are, and not by being smarter, though they are that too. They win by understanding that the qualities which make a person effective are the same qualities that can be turned into a mechanism. A being that grasps this does not need to defeat its enemies. It needs only to arrange a situation in which its enemies, by being fully themselves, accomplish its goals. Isaac's heroism, Carver's devotion, Danik's faith, all of it harvested, all of it converted, all of it pointed at the same outcome by an intelligence that saw the people involved more clearly than they saw themselves. This is the diagnosis of the whole system, and it is bleaker than any individual character's fate. The universe of Dead Space is one in which virtue is not merely unrewarded but structurally exploitable, in which the qualities a person would most want to have are precisely the qualities that make them useful to the thing that ends them. That is not a statement the game makes explicitly. It is the shape that emerges when you stack the characters' arcs beside each other and notice that they all fail in the same way, undone by their best traits, delivered to catastrophe by their own excellence, and the tragedy is completed by the fact that this shape is invisible from inside it. Isaac cannot see that his determination is a handle. Carver cannot see that his devotion is a lever. Danik cannot see that his faith is a leash. Each of them experiences their defining quality as the source of their strength, the thing that will let them prevail, right up until the moment it becomes the thing that destroys them. They are living inside a tragedy and experiencing it until the very end as a story where they might win. Chapter 15. What the ending refuses to give you. Come back now to the last image, the one the game leaves you with, and consider everything it deliberately withholds. A moon rises in front of the Terra Nova. It seems to crash into the ship. Isaac and Carver are knocked unconscious. The screen goes black, and the game ends there, with the explicit acknowledgement, preserved in every account of the ending, that it is unknown whether this final moment is another hallucination or an actual event. The story stops at the precise point where every question it raised would need to be answered, and it answers none of them. This is the last and most important thing to understand about why the ending functions as a tragedy in disguise. A conventional tragedy delivers its catastrophe and then lets the audience grieve. The death happens, the loss lands, and the story gives you the space to feel it fully, to reach the bottom of the sadness and begin, slowly, to come back up. There is a shape to that grief, a completion, a moment where the worst has happened and can be mourned. Dead Space 3's ending refuses to provide even that. It does not confirm that Earth fell. It does not confirm that Isaac and Carver's perceptions are accurate. It does not confirm anything. It leaves the audience in the same suspended, unresolvable uncertainty that Isaac has been living inside. And then it stops. Think about what this does to the experience of the ending. You cannot fully grieve Earth's destruction, because you do not know for certain that Earth was destroyed. You cannot take comfort in the possibility that it was all a hallucination, because a hallucination that complete would mean Isaac is beyond any hope of recovery, which is its own catastrophe. You cannot land anywhere. Every interpretation you reach for dissolves as soon as you grip it, because the game withheld the one piece of information that would let any interpretation stabilize. The uncertainty is not a gap the audience is invited to fill with a comforting theory. The uncertainty is the final and most complete infliction of the marker's signature horror, extended from the character to the person holding the controller. Research on how the human mind handles unresolved narratives has documented that unfinished stories occupy the mind more persistently than finished ones. A story that reaches a clear conclusion can be filed away, integrated, released. A story that stops without resolution keeps returning, keeps demanding the attention the mind reserves for unsolved problems, keeps generating the low hum of an open question that will not close. Dead Space 3's ending weaponizes this. It ensures that the audience will not be able to put the story down, not because the story was satisfying, but because the story refused to end. Over a decade later, people are still arguing about what that final image means, and they are still arguing precisely because the game made certainty impossible. This is the deepest sense in which the ending is a tragedy in disguise. The disguise is not just that a bleak spectacle conceals a precise tragic structure, though it does. The disguise is that the ending presents itself as an ending, while functioning as a wound that cannot close. It looks like a conclusion. It is actually a permanent suspension, a story that stops without finishing, a darkness that could be death, or it could be the doorway to something worse, and the audience is never told which. Isaac and Carver are left in that suspension, alive in a way that offers no relief, and the audience is left there with them, unable to grieve, unable to hope, unable to know, holding a question the game will never answer. The cancellation of Dead Space 4 sealed this. The story was going to continue. There were plans for a final confrontation at Earth, for Isaac facing what he had become, for the war against the moons to reach some kind of resolution. Those plans were never realized. The studio that made these games was closed. Dead Space 4 does not exist and, in its intended form, never will, which means the suspension at the end of the Awakened DLC is not a temporary uncertainty awaiting a sequel's answer. It is the actual, permanent ending of Isaac Clarke's story. He was left unconscious in a ship that a moon was crashing into, above a world that may or may not have been dying, in a state that may or may not have been real, and the story simply stopped there, forever. There is a terrible fittingness to that. Isaac spent 3 games unable to reach a resolution, unable to find the ending that would let his suffering conclude, kept alive past every point where death would have been a mercy. And then the franchise itself, through no design of the developers, delivered him the same fate at the level of narrative existence. His story does not end, it stops. He is suspended in an unresolved darkness, not just within the fiction, but in the actual history of the medium. A character whose arc was building toward a confrontation that was never allowed to happen, left hanging in the exact condition the markers spent 3 games trying to produce in him. The Herald, delivered home, was abandoned there. Chapter 16. The Faces of the Dead. There is a pattern in this franchise that runs deeper than the markers, deeper than the moons, deeper than any single disaster, and it took 3 games to show its full shape. Every person the markers work on most effectively is a person carrying a dead body they never buried, not literally, emotionally. Isaac carries Nicole, Carver carries Damara and Dylan. Danik carries a version of humanity that was already lost to him, a fallen world he believed only convergence could redeem. The markers do not reach for the strong or the weak, the smart or the foolish. They reach for the grieving, and they reach for them through the exact people those grievers cannot let go of. Look at how the markers actually operate on a mind, mechanically, across the whole series. They do not appear as monsters and demand obedience. They appear as the beloved dead. On the Ishimura, Isaac was not driven forward by fear. He was drawn forward by Nicole, by the sound of her voice on a looping message, by the possibility that she was still alive somewhere on that ship, and that reaching her would make all of it mean something. The hallucination wore her face and used her tenderness, and it guided him deeper into the disaster the entire time. The thing that felt most like love was the leash. The reason this works is not supernatural. The reason this works is documented in how human grief actually behaves, and the game is dramatizing a real mechanism rather than inventing a convenient one. When a person loses someone central to their life, the mind does not simply file the loss and move on. For a period that can stretch far longer than anyone expects, the mind continues to run its models of the missing person. It expects them in the doorway. It reaches for the phone to tell them something. It hears their voice in the half-second before waking. Research on how the brain processes the death of an attachment figure has found that the neural systems built around that person do not shut off when the person dies. They keep firing, keep predicting a presence that is no longer there, and that persistent prediction is a large part of what makes grief feel less like sadness and more like a kind of ongoing search. The griever is, in a real neurological sense, still looking for someone their own brain refuses to register as gone. The markers exploit exactly this. A mind that is already generating the presence of a dead person, already running the models, already primed to see the beloved in every shadow, needs only a small push to see them fully. The artifact provides the push. It does not have to build Nicole from nothing. Isaac's own grieving brain was building her already, and the marker simply took over the construction, wore the face his mind had kept warm, and turned his refusal to let her go into a set of controls. The horror is intimate because the mechanism is intimate. The markers do not invade from outside. They move into a space the grief already hollowed out and left open. Carver's version makes the same mechanism visible from a different angle, and watching the 2 men side by side is the clearest way to see what the markers are actually doing. On Tau Volantis, Carver begins to see Damara, bloodied and freezing, her voice turned against him. He sees Dylan's photograph warped into something obscene, the eyes ruined. The visions accuse him. They ask why he is looking for forgiveness when there is none to be found. They tell him it is time to join the party, to stop resisting, to come and be with the family he failed. And the reason these particular images have the power to unmake him is that they are assembled out of the specific guilt he was already carrying. Carver believed he was a poor husband and a worse father. He had, before any of this, stood at the edge of taking his own life and written his goodbye to Damara, telling her that things would be better once he was gone. The markers did not have to invent Carver's self-hatred. He brought it with him, fully formed, and they poured it into the faces of the people he had lost. Consider what it reveals about the markers as a threat, that this is their primary method. They are not, at the level that matters most, a physical danger. The necromorphs are the physical danger, the reanimated bodies, the claws and the transformation. The markers themselves are a psychological weapon, and their target is the part of a person that loved and lost and never recovered. This is why proximity to a marker produces the specific sequence it always produces. Insomnia first, then paranoia, then visions, then a religious certainty that the artifact has something to say. That sequence is the sequence of a mind being hollowed out through its own attachments and refilled with the artifact's purpose. The markers do not break people randomly. They break people along the seams that grief already cut. There is a term for an organism that inserts itself into a host, hijacks the host's own systems, and redirects the host's behavior toward the organism's reproduction rather than the host's survival. In biology, certain parasites are known to alter the behavior of the creatures they infect, driving them toward actions that serve the parasite's life cycle at the direct expense of the host's. An infected creature will climb to an exposed height it would normally avoid, or approach the predator it would normally flee, because the thing living inside it has rewired its drives to complete a reproductive cycle the host will not survive. The host experiences these altered drives as its own. It does not feel controlled. It feels like itself, making choices, right up until the choices deliver it to the death the parasite required. The markers are this, applied to consciousness instead of the body. They enter through grief, rewire the drives, and redirect the host toward convergence, toward the completion of the moon, toward the reproduction of the thing that infected them. And the host feels like itself the entire time. Isaac felt like a man searching for the woman he loved. Carver felt like a man completing his wife's mission and honoring his family. Danik felt like a prophet delivering his species to salvation. Each of them experienced the redirected drive as their own deepest desire, because the markers had built the redirection out of their own deepest desires. The parasite that works through love does not need to overcome the host's will. It becomes the host's will, wearing the face of whatever the host most wanted. This reframes the entire convergence event, and it is worth slowing down to see the full picture, because convergence is usually described only in its physical form. In the physical description, convergence is the process by which the markers aggregate all organic matter on a world into a single rising mass, a moon, a planet-sized necromorph that then travels the galaxy to seed the same process elsewhere. That description is accurate, and it is incomplete. Convergence is also, in every documented case, the endpoint of a mass psychological process. Before the bodies merge, the minds do. A population near a fully active marker network does not simply get eaten. It gets converted, driven mad in a coordinated pattern, filled with the same certainty, the same religious pull toward the artifact, until the people themselves want the thing that will consume them. The alien civilization on Tau Volantis went through this. Humanity, across 2 centuries, was being walked through the early stages of it. The theology of Unitology, the growing conviction that the markers offered transcendence and unity, was not a distraction from the threat. It was the threat, operating on schedule, preparing a population to desire its own convergence before the physical process ever began. This is the real horror the franchise is built around, and it is larger than any monster. The markers weaponize the human need for meaning. They take the deepest and most defensible human impulses, the love of a lost person, the search for purpose after loss, the longing for a unity that would make the suffering worthwhile, and they turn each of those impulses into a component of a machine designed to end the species that felt them. A person with no attachments, no grief, no hunger for meaning would be nearly useless to the markers. It is precisely the people who love most, who mourn most, who most need their pain to mean something, that the markers can most fully use. The better a person is at loving, the more thoroughly the markers can hollow them. Return to Isaac with this understanding, and his role as Herald stops looking like a biological accident and starts looking like the culmination of everything the markers do. The compatible DNA is the physical layer, the reason his mind could carry the signal so completely. Underneath the physical layer sits the emotional one, and the emotional one is where the markers actually did their work. Isaac was chosen not only because his biology fit the signal, but because his grief was enormous. and his loyalty was total, and his refusal to give up was absolute. A herald needs to survive, and Isaac survived because he would not stop. A herald needs to keep moving toward the target, and Isaac kept moving because the markers gave him people to move toward. Nicole, and then Ellie. Dead love and then living love, one after another, always a reason to go forward, always a reason that felt like his own. The markers did not drag Isaac to earth. They gave him, at every stage, someone to walk toward, and they let his love do the walking. There is a specific cruelty in how the two loves function across his arc. Nicole was already dead when the first game began, and the markers used her death, her absence, the hole she left, to pull Isaac through the Ishimura. Ellie was alive, and the markers used her life, her danger, her need, to pull Isaac to Tau Volantis and into the mission that would carry him home as the Herald. Dead love and living love, both converted into fuel, both pointed at the same destination. Isaac never had a chance to love anyone in a way the markers could not use, because the markers had positioned themselves at the exact center of his capacity to love. Every direction his heart pointed was a direction they had already claimed. Watch how this closes the loop with Carver's choice at the machine. When Carver threw the codex to Danik to save Ellie, the analysis earlier framed it as the most human choice producing catastrophe. Now the deeper mechanism is visible. Carver's devotion, the same devotion the markers had been using against him through the visions of Damara and Dylan, was the thing that moved his hand. He could not let another person die in front of a man trying to save them, because his entire wound was built around a family he had failed to save. The markers did not need to be present in that room to influence the choice. They had already spent the whole game deepening the exact groove that made the choice inevitable. Carver saving Ellie was Carver being Carver, and Carver being Carver was, by that point, something the markers had been shaping toward this outcome for the length of the mission. The people who survive the markers, in the rare cases where anyone does, tend to survive by a route that the games treat almost as an accusation. They survive by being harder to reach, by having less to grieve, or by refusing the meaning the markers offer even when refusing it costs them everything. Isaac, in the first two games, survived partly by holding on to a version of himself that would not fully surrender to the artifact's story. That resistance is real, and it is why he was worth cultivating rather than simply consuming. A person the markers can consume immediately becomes a necromorph and is used up. A person who resists just enough to stay themselves while slowly saturating with the signal becomes something more valuable. A carrier, a herald. Isaac's very resistance, the thing that made him a hero, made him the more useful tool because it kept him intact and moving while the signal did its slower work underneath. He was strong enough to stay Isaac, and staying Isaac was exactly what the markers needed him to do. Step back and look at the whole shape of it. A person loses someone they love. The loss leaves a space, and the mind, refusing to accept the loss, keeps that space open, keeps generating the presence of the person who is gone. Into that open space, something moves. It wears the face of the beloved. It speaks with the beloved's tenderness or the beloved's accusation, whichever will move the griever more effectively. It turns the refusal to let go into a set of controls, and it walks the griever toward a purpose that serves the thing in the space rather than the person carrying it. And the griever feels, the entire time, like a person acting out of love, because they are. The love is real. The love is the mechanism. The two were never separable. That is the engine underneath the entire Dead Space universe, and it is why the story reaches people who have never held a plasma cutter or fought a necromorph. Everyone who has grieved knows the feeling of a mind that will not register a loss, that keeps the missing person present, that reaches for a phone or turns toward a doorway out of a habit the death did not break. The games take that ordinary and universal experience and follow it to its most extreme possible conclusion. What if the presence your grief keeps generating could be occupied? What if the love you cannot release could be turned into a hand on your back, guiding you somewhere you would never choose to go? What if the best thing about you, your capacity to love past death, was the exact door through which the end of everything walked in? Isaac Clarke spent 3 games being guided by the dead and the endangered, toward a home he would help destroy, by a force that lived in the space his love kept open. He never buried Nicole, and the thing wearing her face walked him to the Ishimura's heart. He could not abandon Ellie, and his refusal to abandon her walked him to the ship that carried the signal to Earth. At every step, the markers offered him someone to save, and at every step the saving served them. The faces of the dead, and the faces of the living he feared to lose, were the same instrument all along. And the instrument was tuned to the one frequency Isaac could never stop responding to. He was reachable because he loved. He was useful because he loved well. And the better he loved, the more completely he belonged to the thing that was always, patiently, wearing the faces he could not let go. Chapter 17. The Man in the Window. So return one last time to the two men at the window, and see them now with everything we have assembled. Isaac Clarke is looking at Earth, whether it is really Earth, whether it is really burning, whether the moons are really there, or whether all of it is a construction inside a mind that stopped being reliable a long time ago. He cannot know, and neither can we. What he is looking at, in every version of the ending, is the outcome of his entire life. He fought harder than anyone. He survived what no one else survived. He loved, and was guided by everyone he loved, and came back to the fight when Ellie was in danger. He crossed the galaxy. He climbed inside a rising moon and shut it down. He should have died, and he did not, because something needed him alive. And now he is home, and home is the thing he was carrying the poison toward the entire time. There is a specific human experience the game is reaching for in this final image, and it is worth naming clearly because it is the thing that makes Isaac's story resonate past its science fiction trappings. It is the experience of arriving at the end of an enormous effort and discovering that the effort was pointed in the wrong direction, or was used for something you did not intend, or accomplished the opposite of what you meant. Most people encounter a small version of this at some point. The relationship you fought to save that needed to end. The goal you sacrificed everything for that turned out not to matter. The help you offered that made things worse. Isaac's story is that experience rendered at cosmic scale, made total, stripped of any consolation. He gave everything, and everything he gave was used against the thing he was trying to protect, and he survives it. That is the final cruelty, restated one more time because it is the heart of the whole tragedy. He does not get to die at the window. He does not get the release. The moon crashes into the ship, and he lives, carried forward into a galaxy facing extinction, condemned to keep existing in the aftermath of his own failure and his own unwitting complicity. The developers confirmed he survived. Carver survived. Two men who watched the world end are still alive at the end of the last chapter anyone will ever see of their story, and their survival is the punishment, the sentence, the thing the markers do, instead of granting the mercy of an ending. Look at what the whole franchise was, viewed from this vantage. It began as a survival horror game about an engineer on a haunted mining ship, a story that seemed to be about the triumph of an ordinary person's ingenuity against overwhelming odds, and it ends, in its intended shape, as one of the bleakest character tragedies the medium has produced, the story of a good man whose goodness was harvested, whose survival was cultivated, whose every victory was permitted, and who was delivered at last to the destruction of everything he loved, and then denied even the dignity of dying alongside it. The distance between what Dead Space appeared to be and what it actually was is the same distance the hidden messages in the chapter titles describe. The truth was there from the beginning. You could not read it until it was too late. That is why Dead Space 3's ending is a tragedy in disguise. Not because it hides a sad ending behind a spectacular one, though it does. It is a tragedy in disguise because it hides the oldest and most precise kind of tragedy, the kind where a person is destroyed by their own greatness, inside a genre and a presentation that trained audiences to expect a hero's victory. It disguises a story about the futility of virtue as a story about fighting monsters. It disguises a permanent, unresolvable wound as an ending. And it disguises, right up until the final revelation, the fact that the man you were controlling, the man you were rooting for, the man whose survival you fought for across 3 games, was the thing carrying the end of the world home in his own compatible blood. He is at the window. The moon is rising, the screen is about to go black, and he still, even now, even here, does not fully understand what he was. He thinks he failed to save the world. The more terrible truth, the one the game buries beneath its bleak surface, is that the world was never his to save, because he was the delivery. He was cherished by the thing that ended everything. He was kept alive by the force he was fighting. He was the hero, and being the hero was exactly what made him the Herald, and there was never a version of his story where those two things could be pulled apart. The lights of Earth are going out. 2 men are watching, and they will keep watching, and keep surviving, and keep carrying what they carry, into a darkness the story chose never to illuminate.